May 1944. The Liri Valley, Italy. The earth here does not smell of spring. It smells of cordite, wet ash, and the iron tang of blood that is soaked into the soil for months. Through the lens of history, we often view the liberation of Europe as an inevitable tide, a sweeping blue arrow across a map. But on the ground, in the shadow of the Apennine Mountains, there was nothing inevitable about it. There was only mud. There was only fear. And ahead, rising out of the mist like a dragon's teeth, was the Hitler Line. Zoom in on a platoon of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division. They are pressed flat against the cold Italian earth, helmets ringing with the terrifying shriek of MG-42 machine gun fire, the Hitler's zipper ripping through the air at 1,200 rounds per minute. A young lieutenant, his face masked in grime, presses a radio handset to his ear, screaming to be heard over the deafening roar of Nebelwerfer rockets impacting nearby. "We're pinned down! This line, it's like steel! We can't move an inch!" Above them, from concrete bunkers reinforced with feet of steel, the German 10th Army pours a hellstorm of fire down into the valley. These are not hasty field fortifications. This is the Adolf Hitler Line, a defensive network named after the Führer himself, a psychological and military declaration that this is where the Allied advance dies. A Canadian private, gripping his Lee Enfield rifle, looks up at the smoke-choked sky. His eyes are wide, reflecting the frustration of an entire army. He turns to his sergeant, his voice barely a whisper amidst the chaos. The Yanks couldn't break the defenses at Cassino alone. The Brits have been bleeding here for weeks. So why the hell are we here? What makes us different? It was a question echoed in the war rooms of London and Washington. By the spring of 1944, the Allied campaign in Italy had become a grueling stalemate. The soft underbelly of Europe, as Winston Churchill had famously promised, had turned into a tough old gut. The Allies had smashed their heads against the Gustav Line at Monte Cassino, paying for every yard of ground with thousands of lives. And even if they broke through Gustav, the Germans had prepared a second nightmare behind it, the Hitler Line. This was a masterpiece of military engineering. It was an interconnected web of concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches deep enough to swallow a Sherman whole, and dense minefields laid with calculating cruelty. But its most terrifying feature was the Panzerturm, actual Panther tank turrets, dismantled from their hulls and mounted on buried concrete bunkers. Low profile, high velocity, and nearly invisible until they fired. It was a fortress designed to stop an empire. The Americans had tried to flank the German defenses and bogged down at Anzio. The British had thrown wave after wave of brave men against the rocky slopes of Cassino. The morale of the Allied forces was fraying. The skepticism was palpable. If the industrial might of the United States and the imperial power of Great Britain had been stalled by Kesselring's defenses, what hope did a volunteer army from Canada have? The Canadian Corps in Italy was often viewed as a junior partner, a colonial force there to bolster the numbers of the British 8th Army. They were not the stars of the newsreels. They were the shock troops, the ones sent in when the fighting turned ugly, close, and desperate. But as the dust settled over the Liri Valley in late May, the world would learn that these men from the prairies of Saskatchewan, the forests of British Columbia, and the factories of Ontario were not just filling a gap in the line. They were the sledgehammer that would shatter it. In the spring of 1944, the Hitler Line had survived everything the Allies threw at it: American armor, British infantry, artillery barrages that turned ancient villages into rubble. It stood defiant, blocking the road to Rome. So how did a so-called colonial army from Canada succeed where the great empires failed? How did they crack the fortress that bore the name of the devil himself? This is not just a story of strategy and maps. It is the story of a feat of arms that has been overshadowed by history, yet remains one of the most brutal and brilliant achievements of the Second World War. This is how the Canadian Army broke the Hitler line, a feat the Americans and the British could not achieve. To understand the sheer magnitude of the task that lay before the Canadians, one must first dismantle one of the greatest misconceptions of the Second World War. Winston Churchill had famously persuaded the Allied High Command to invade Italy by calling it the soft underbelly of Europe. It was a seductive metaphor. Strike at the weaker partner of the Axis, knock Italy out of the war, and open a back door into the heart of the Third Reich. But as the Allied armies soon discovered, there was nothing soft about Italy. It was a jagged spine of limestone peaks, freezing rivers, and narrow valleys that seemed designed by a higher power specifically for defensive warfare. By the winter of 1943, the Allied advance had bogged down into an attritional nightmare reminiscent of the First World War. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, was a master of defense. He understood that he didn't need to defeat the Allies in a pitched battle. He simply needed to make them bleed for every mile. And to do this, he utilized the terrain to construct a series of defensive belts across the width of the peninsula. The most formidable of these was the Winter Line, anchored by the Gustav Line at the monastery of Monte Cassino. For months, American and British forces threw themselves against the Gustav Line. The battles were ferocious. The U.S. Fifth Army was mauled at the Rapido River. The British Eighth Army and the Polish Corps suffered horrific casualties scaling the slopes of Monastery Hill. But what the Allied soldiers feared even more than the Gustav Line was the rumor of what lay 6 miles behind it. German engineers, utilizing forced labor and the organizational genius of the Todt organization, had spent months constructing a second fallback position across the Liri Valley. Originally, they christened it the Hitler Riegel, the Hitler Line. Naming a defensive line after the Führer was a double-edged sword. It was a propaganda boast of invincibility, but it also carried a terrifying implicit order. This line must not fall, for its collapse would be a personal humiliation to Adolf Hitler himself. The Hitler Line was not merely a collection of trenches. It was a killing machine, an industrial-scale trap designed to massacre infantry and pulverize armor. Stretching from the Aranci Mountains to the town of Piedimonte San Germano, it turned the flat, open terrain of the Liri Valley into a devil's garden. The engineering was diabolical. The Germans understood that the Allies relied heavily on their superiority in tanks, specifically the American-made Shermans. To counter this, they dug deep anti-tank ditches, some 20 feet wide and 10 feet deep, stretching for miles. These weren't just obstacles, they were kill zones, pre-sighted by artillery and mortars. If a tank tried to bridge the ditch, it would be destroyed. If it tried to go around, it would be channeled into minefields so dense that in some sectors there was a mine every 3 feet. But the true teeth of the Hitler Line were the pillboxes. These were not simple sandbag emplacements. They were reinforced concrete bunkers, sunk deep into the earth, covered with soil and vegetation until they were invisible to aerial reconnaissance. Inside, machine gun crews manned the MG-42, a weapon capable of cutting a man in half at 500 yards. These bunkers were arranged in interlocking fields of fire, meaning that if you attacked one, you were exposed to the fire of 2 others. Yet, the most feared weapon on the Hitler Line was an innovation that caught the Allies completely off guard: the Panzerturm. The Germans had taken the turrets off their Panther tanks, arguably the best medium tank of the war, and mounted them on top of buried concrete bunkers. These emplacements presented a tiny silhouette, barely rising above the tall grass. But they packed the high-velocity 75mm KWK-42 gun, a weapon that could punch through the frontal armor of a Sherman or a Churchill tank from over a kilometer away like a hot knife through butter. To the Allied tankers, these were invisible assassins. You wouldn't see the muzzle flash until your own tank was already burning. This was the reality facing the Allied armies in May 1944. The Americans and the British were not incompetent. They were exhausted. They had hammered against the outer shell of the German defenses for months. They had taken Monte Cassino at a terrible price, only to look up and see this fresh, untouched nightmare waiting for them. The feeling in the ranks was one of dread. Infantrymen looked at the flat killing grounds of the Leary Valley and saw no cover, no way forward. The sentiment was muttered in foxholes from the American sector to the British lines. If this is the soft underbelly, I'd hate to see the hard part. The German defenders, the elite 1st Parachute Division and experienced Panzer Grenadiers, were dug in. They had received the Führer order, hold at all costs. The road to Rome ran straight through them, and they intended to make the Leary Valley the graveyard of the Allied advance. As the dust settled on the preliminary skirmishes, it became clear that the Hitler line would not be broken by maneuvering or clever feints. It would have to be smashed. It required a force that was fresh, aggressive, and willing to accept casualties that would break a lesser army. It is here that the camera of history shifts focus. Scene: dawn. A Canadian reconnaissance officer lies prone on a ridge, peering through his binoculars. The morning mist clings to the valley floor. Through the magnified lenses, the landscape looks deceptively peaceful. Green fields, a farmhouse, a quiet river. But then he spots it. The glint of metal in the grass. The unnatural mound of earth that hides a bunker. The jagged lines of barbed wire that stretch into infinity. He lowers the binoculars, his face pale, the realization settling in his gut like a stone. He turns to his radio operator, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a cold, hard understanding of what is to come. "This isn't just a line," he whispers. "It's a slaughterhouse waiting to open." Fade to black. While the British 8th Army and the American 5th Army were locked in their deadly embrace with the Gustav Line, a new force was moving into position in the Leary Valley. They moved at night, under the cover of darkness and strict radio silence, their vehicle markings obscured by mud and grease. They were the hidden dagger in the Allied hand. They were the 1st Canadian Corps. To the German High Command, the arrival of the Canadians was always a cause for concern. By 1944, the Canadian Army in Italy had forged a reputation that far exceeded its size. They were not professional soldiers of an old empire like the British, steeped in centuries of tradition. Nor were they the drafted masses of an industrial superpower like the United States. They were volunteers. They were wheat farmers from Saskatchewan who knew how to fix machinery with baling wire. They were lumberjacks from British Columbia with shoulders built for swinging axes. They were hard rock miners from northern Ontario who understood the geometry of explosives. They were a citizen army, pragmatic, cynical about glory, but terrifyingly effective when the shooting started. They had earned their stripes in the dust of Sicily and the mud of the Moro River. But it was in the streets of Ortona, the little Stalingrad of Italy, that the Canadians truly showed the world who they were. In December 1943, faced with elite German paratroopers in a brutal house-to-house slugfest, the Canadians didn't retreat. They invented mouse-holing, blasting through internal walls to clear buildings room by room. And they ground the enemy down until the town was theirs. That victory proved one thing. When you needed a position taken, no matter the cost, you sent in the Canadians. Now, in May 1944, General Oliver Leese, commander of the 8th Army, decided to play his ace. The British and Indian divisions would maintain pressure on the flanks, but the task of smashing the Hitler line itself, the killing blow, was given to the 1st Canadian Infantry Division and the 5th Canadian Armored Division. It was a heavy mantle to wear. As the Canadian columns rumbled past the wreckage of British tanks and the exhausted faces of American infantrymen rotating off the line, the whispers began to circulate. The rumor mill was ruthless. The Yanks tried to flank it and got stuck. The Brits hit the wire and bounced off. Now it's our turn. They knew they weren't being sent in to probe the defenses. They were being sent in to break them. The plan was dubbed Operation Chesterfield. It was simple, brutal, and devoid of finesse. There would be no clever flanking maneuvers. The terrain didn't allow for it. This was to be a frontal assault. The infantry would have to walk directly into the teeth of the German guns to clear a path through the minefields. Only then could the tanks of the 5th Armored Division punch through the gap and race for the Melfa River. In the staging areas, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Soldiers cleaned their Bren guns and sharpened bayonets with grim dedication. Letters were written home, sealed and handed to chaplains, just in case. One private, writing by the light of a small kerosene lamp, captured the mood of the entire corps. They say this line is unbreakable. They say the concrete is too thick and the mines are too deep. I suppose tomorrow morning we're going to find out if that's true. The artillery preparation began. The Canadians were famous for their artillery, and they brought everything they had. Hundreds of guns were registered on the German positions. The coordination between the infantry commanders and the artillery observers was meticulous. They were preparing a creeping barrage, a curtain of exploding steel that would move just ahead of the advancing troops. It was a dangerous game. Walk too slow, and the Germans recover. Walk too fast, and you walk into your own shells. As the sun began to set on May 22, 1944, a silence fell over the valley. The heavy, suffocating silence that always precedes a storm. In the command post, Major General Chris Vokes of the 1st Division looked at the map of the Hitler line, marked with red ink for enemy strongpoints. He knew that by this time tomorrow, thousands of his boys would be dead or maimed. But he also knew there was no other way to Rome. Under the cover of a smokescreen, the infantry battalions moved to their start lines. The Royal Canadian Regiment, the Seaforth Highlanders, the Carleton and Yorks. Men lay in the wet grass, checking their watches, waiting for the dawn that would bring hell to earth. A company commander turned to his sergeant, looking out toward the invisible enemy bunkers hidden in the darkness. His voice was low, carrying the weight of a nation that had come of age in the trenches of a previous war. "Tomorrow," he said, "the world will either hear that Canada broke Hitler's line, or they will hear that we were broken trying." 6 o'clock hours, May 23, 1944. The sun did not rise over the Leary Valley that morning. Instead, the dawn was dragged into existence by the fire of 800 Allied guns. In a single earth-shattering instant, the silence of the Italian countryside was annihilated. The barrage was designed to be a creeping wall of death, a moving curtain of high explosives that would pulverize the German defenses just yards ahead of the advancing Canadian infantry. For a few terrifying minutes, the Hitler line vanished behind a wall of gray smoke, pulverized rock, and fire. Then, the whistle blew. From the wheat fields and the muddy ditches, the men of the 1st Canadian Division rose. The Carleton and York Regiment, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. They stepped out of cover and began to walk. The plan relied on the artillery suppressing the German defenders, but as the Canadians advanced through the waist-high corn and the tangled vineyards, the smoke began to clear. And from the impenetrable bunkers of the Hitler line, the response was immediate. The barrage had not killed them all. The Germans, shook but alive in their concrete tombs, manned their weapons. The air suddenly snapped with the sound of thousands of bullets. The lead platoons were cut down in seconds. The open ground in front of the wire became a killing zone. But this is where the Canadian attack differed from those that had come before. When the Americans had hit similar resistance, they often pulled back to call in airstrikes. When the British were pinned, they maneuvered. But the Canadians, hemmed in by the narrow valley and driven by a cold, desperate necessity, did neither. They simply kept moving. It was a tactic born of grit rather than finesse. When a section was wiped out, the survivors didn't retreat. They crawled forward. When an officer fell, a sergeant took command. When the sergeant fell, a private took the lead. The battle devolved into a series of brutal, isolated duels. The German defensive web was designed to separate the infantry from their tank support. Canadian Sherman tanks, pushing forward to support the infantry, found themselves blindly navigating through dust clouds so thick that commanders had to stand open in their turrets just to see. And waiting for them were the panzer terms. The tank battles that morning were fought at point-blank range. In the confusion, a Sherman might round a copse of trees and find itself staring down the barrel of a Panther turret only 200 yards away. The exchange was often fatal for the Canadians. Burning tanks littered the approach, their crews bailing out into machine gun fire. But the Canadians adapted with terrifying speed. Realizing that long-range gunnery was useless against the low-profile bunkers, tank crews began to use their 30-ton machines like sniper rifles. They drove their Shermans recklessly close, ignoring the anti-tank fire, to blast high-explosive shells directly into the firing slits of the German pillboxes. Simultaneously, the infantry worked their way into the Devil's Garden. This was not a sweeping charge. It was a slow, agonizing grind. It was the Seaforth Highlanders clearing a trench line with grenades and bayonets. It was the Carleton and Yorks using their own bodies to bridge the wire. They were biting into the line, chewing off one bunker, then the next, then the next. One particular engagement epitomized the Canadian spirit that day. A single German heavy machine gun post was holding up an entire company, pinning them in a shallow ditch. The supporting tank had been knocked out. By all military logic, the attack should have halted. Instead, a small group of infantrymen, covered in mud and blood, flanked the position under withered fire, got within throwing range, and silenced the gun with grenades. There were no grand speeches, just the grim, silent work of killing the enemy so the line could move forward. Inside the German command posts, the mood began to shift from confidence to disbelief. The German defenders were elite troops. They were used to seeing Allied attacks falter when casualties mounted. But these Canadians were not faltering. They were absorbing horrific punishment. Battalions were being reduced to the size of companies, but they were still coming. The integrity of the defensive line, that carefully calculated web of interlocking fire, was being disrupted by the sheer stubbornness of the attackers. The Canadians were not looking for a weak spot. They were making one. By early afternoon, the battlefield was a chaotic smear of smoke and noise. The cost had been exorbitant. The fields were strewn with the bodies of the 1st Division. But looking through the haze, the German commanders saw something terrifying. In the center of the line, near Aquino, the defensive fire was slackening. Not because the Canadians had retreated, but because the bunkers had been silenced. A map of the battle at this moment would show not a clean arrow piercing the line, but a jagged, messy stain spreading across the German defenses. The Americans had tested the line and bled. The British had been thrown back. But the Canadians were doing something different. They were refusing to let go of the enemy's throat. And then, amidst the roar of battle, came the sound that every soldier prays for, the crackle of a radio message from the front. Objective taken. Send the armor. The shell was cracked. The Canadians had opened the door to Rome. The decisive moment did not look like a parade. It looked like a brawl. By late afternoon on May 23rd, the structure of the Hitler line began to disintegrate. The Canadian infantry, having literally crawled over the bodies of their comrades, had secured a fragile foothold near the town of Aquino. The German defenders, who had fought with fanatical discipline for hours, suddenly found the geometry of the battle turning against them. A bunker that was impregnable from the front was suddenly vulnerable from the flank. A panzer term that had dominated the valley floor was silenced by a Canadian tank firing from a mere 50 yards away. Into this chaotic breach, the order was given to release the 5th Canadian Armored Division. The ground shook as the heavy engines of the Shermans roared to life. This was the exploitation phase, the moment military theorists dream of. The tanks surged through the gaps torn open by the infantry, their tracks grinding over the shattered concrete and twisted barbed wire of the Hitler line. They raced toward the Melfa River, the last natural barrier before the open road to Rome. The German retreat, initially orderly, threatened to turn into a rout. The psychological impact was devastating. The Hitler Riegel, the line named after the Führer, the fortress that was supposed to bleed the Allies dry, had been punctured in less than 24 hours. Field Marshal Kesselring, realizing his nightmare scenario was unfolding, had no choice. To stay was to be encircled. He issued the order to withdraw. The road to Rome was effectively open. But as the dust settled, a difficult question arose, one that would be debated in mess halls and staff colleges for years to come. Why did the Canadians succeed here, on this specific patch of hell, when the formidable American and British armies had been stalled for so long at the gates of the Leary Valley? The answer lies not in superior equipment or secret weapons, but in a brutal tactical reality. The Americans and British had fought magnificently at Cassino and Anzio, but they were exhausted by months of attrition. The Canadians brought a terrifying freshness to the fight, combined with a tactical doctrine honed in the street fighting of Ortona. They understood that you could not finesse a fortress. You had to dismantle it, piece by piece, regardless of the cost. It was a victory of combined arms at its most visceral level. Canadian tank commanders didn't wait for the infantry to clear the way. They charged into the minefields to draw fire. Infantry platoon leaders didn't wait for the tanks to suppress every bunker. They charged machine gun nests with hand grenades. It was this refusal to stop, this collective stubbornness to accept the unacceptable risk, that overwhelmed the German defenders. The Germans could calculate firing angles and kill zones, but they could not calculate an enemy that simply refused to break. Yet, this victory was not a miracle. It was a transaction. And the currency used to purchase the road to Rome was Canadian blood. The casualty figures for Operation Chesterfield were staggering. In a single day of fighting, the 1st Canadian Corps suffered over 1,000 casualties. Some infantry companies were reduced to a handful of men. The fields in front of the Hitler line were carpeted with khaki uniforms. As the sun set on May 23rd, the euphoria of victory was muted by the sheer scale of the slaughter. A Canadian war correspondent walking through the breach the next morning described the scene. It was a landscape of the dead. Tanks burned quietly in the rain. Men lay where they fell, facing forward, always forward. In the command tents, the generals looked at the maps with relief. The strategic objective had been achieved. But on the side of the road, a young Canadian soldier sat on an ammunition crate, his face blackened by soot, his hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. He looked back at the smoke rising from the Hitler line, the unbreakable wall that now lay in ruins behind him. They said it couldn't be done. The Canadians had just proved them wrong. But God, look what it cost. In the days following the breach of the Hitler line, the Allied armies surged forward. The German 10th Army, its spine broken by the Canadian assault, retreated north in disarray. On June 4th, 1944, American troops entered Rome. It was a monumental achievement, the first Axis capital to fall. The news flashed across the globe. Church bells rang in London and New York. The soldiers in Italy, covered in the dust of the Leary Valley, allowed themselves a brief moment of pride. But history is a cruel editor. Less than 48 hours after Rome fell, on June 6, 1944, the Allied Armada landed on the beaches of Normandy. D-Day. The eyes of the world instantly shifted from the sunny piazzas of Rome to the gray sands of France. The colossal scale of Operation Overlord eclipsed everything else. The brutal struggle in Italy, the breaking of the Hitler line, the thousands of Canadians who had bled for every inch of the Leary Valley, all of it was relegated to the back pages of the newspapers. The men of the 1st Canadian Corps did not get a parade. They did not get to go home. They were quietly pulled off the line, refitted, and sent to the next battle, and then the next. From the Gothic line to the frozen rivers of the Netherlands, they fought on. For decades after the war, the popular narrative of victory was dominated by the superpowers. We remember the Americans' sweeping advance across France. We remember the British stoicism during the Blitz. The Canadian contribution in Italy often became a footnote, a chapter skipped over in high school history books. They were even mockingly called the D-Day Dodgers, a bitter joke implying they had missed the real war in France. But to accept that narrative is to ignore the truth etched into the headstones of the Casino War Cemetery. The breaking of the Hitler line was not a sideshow. It was a pivot point. It proved that the German war machine, for all its concrete and steel, for all its terrifying technology, could be broken by determination. It sent a tremor of fear through the Wehrmacht command. If a colonial army could smash their strongest defensive line in 72 hours, then no fortress in Europe was safe. For Canada, a young nation still forging its identity, this battle was another Vimy Ridge. It reinforced a hard-earned truth. Canada was not a military superpower with endless resources. It was not an empire with centuries of martial tradition. But it was a nation that produced a specific kind of soldier, pragmatic, uncomplaining, and fiercely capable. When the Allied High Command had a problem that could not be solved by maneuvering, when they faced a wall that simply had to be smashed, they called the Canadians. The legacy of the Hitler line is not found in movies or video games. It is found in the silence of the Leary Valley today. If you walk those fields now, the bunkers are overgrown with vines. The craters have been filled by farmers. But the soil remembers. It remembers the farm boys from Saskatchewan who had never seen an ocean before 1939. It remembers the loggers from British Columbia and the factory workers from Ontario. Men who had no business fighting a war on the other side of the world, but who went anyway. Men who looked at the most formidable fortifications the Nazi regime could build and simply refused to stop walking. We tell this story not to diminish the sacrifices of the Americans or the British, who fought with equal valor on 1,000 other battlefields. We tell it because history often remembers the biggest flags and the loudest victories. But sometimes, the most impossible feats are carried out by those who never asked for glory, only for the chance to do their duty, and perhaps, just perhaps, come home alive. In the spring of 1944, the world asked who could break the unbreakable line. The Americans had tried. The British had tried. The Canadians answered.